We wanted to have a little different environment, perhaps something that would feel more like a living room, a reading where you'd have the opportunity to be a part, maybe a little more intimate feel than the auditorium. So that's why we've moved here, and then after you'll have an opportunity perhaps to have some coffee or refreshments. I'm not even quite sure what we have. But this is going to be a very simple but hopefully an inspiring experience for all of us who admire good writing and all of us who aspire to be good writers. We're just going to ask the participants, many of whom you have met earlier, to set the stage for the reading and then read a portion of it, and then we'll move on. So it's very simple, and then this will be followed by a book signing. We'll have the books that the authors have asked to be brought over, and there will be a book signing and an opportunity outside for you to get a book signed, and again, perhaps have a very brief moment to talk with the authors if you haven't had a chance to do that already. I want to make two introductions of readers who you didn't have the opportunity to hear from on the panels earlier today. And the first, our lead-off reader, is going to be Doug Starr. Doug happens to be the director of our Science and Medical Journalism master's degree program at Boston University, but he is also a very accomplished and successful writer of narrative nonfiction. His most recent book, which is still out there and still doing very well, is he will describe this. It's a book about a 19th century serial killing that if you read it and follow it, it will capture you, pick you up into that narrative and sweep you along as any crime novel might do. So you'll hear from Doug Starr, and you're also going to hear from Lou Ureneck. Lou is, and I should have acknowledged this earlier, Lou was the person who really gave birth to this conference and shepherded it from where the founder of the conference, Mark Kramer, and in many ways worked with Isabel to bring this conference to life a year ago. He then went off and has just returned literally a couple of days ago from Kiev, where he has been teaching for the past semester in a program over there, which I'm sure will probably lead to other writings. But you'll hear Lou read from one of his books, or one of the new book that you're working on to be released. So in any event, I wanted you to know who they were before they came up. And so with that, I hope you will sit back and enjoy this, and Doug Starr is going to kick us off.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Doug Starr. As Tom said, I'm the co-director of our graduate program in Science and Medical Journalism. It's one of the few in the country, and graduates of the program are at places like National Geographic, Nova, NPR. So if you have a science background and this kind of thing appeals to you, please come see me afterwards. This book, The Killer of Little Shepherds and the Birth of Forensic Science, is exemplary of the attitude we take towards science. We're not really interested in geeky, gadget-driven science, but we're interested in science as an eternal human endeavor, the search for objective truth. And there are certain things, despite what politicians might tell you, are facts and objective truth. And it's an important endeavor. So, like many people, I got interested in these CSI shows, and I wondered, how did it all begin? And I was drawn to these French doctors at the turn of the century who pretty much invented forensic science or criminal psychology as we know it. This was an interesting time because it was the birth of a lot of sciences. Pasteur was alive, Darwin was alive, Freud was alive, and a coterie of scientists all over Europe started realizing that now that they knew something about psychology, they knew that witnesses often lie. And that the best thing to do was collect what they called the silent evidence that provided truth. And along with that, they had their first debates about the nature-nurture problem, in which why do people do such terrible things? So this was part of it too. I was also drawn to the period because this really was when the question of good and evil went from the clergy to the scientists. And finally, this period was so interesting because it was so much like our own. You know, the turn of the century was this time of surface prosperity, under which there was terrible poverty, there was social unrest, it was the birth of consumer culture, There was a terrorism growing called the anarchist movement, and it was all fueled by the tabloid press. So with that in mind, I'll tell you a few pieces of the story of Dr. Alexandre Lacassagne, the premier forensic scientist of his time, and his arch enemy, Joseph Vacher, who killed more than twice as many people as Jack the Ripper. And in some ways, the story follows the two of them as they come together, and they exemplify the forces of light and the forces of darkness. So here's just a brief glimpse of each character. Dr. Alexandre Lacassagne already was well respected in his field when he encountered the case that would make him world famous. As one of the early scholars of legal medicine, he had developed many new techniques in crime scene analysis, such as determining how long a body had been putrefying and how to match a bullet to a gun. He developed procedures by which even country doctors could perform professional autopsies if called to a crime scene. Colleagues admired him not only as a scientist, but as a scholar, teacher, and friend. As people often did in those days, they saw his character revealed in his appearance. And a noble physiognomy it was, with a high forehead, handlebar mustache, and Burgomeister's girth. With his energy and talent, he could have done anything, but he chose the new field of criminology. To him, it encompassed the scale of human experience, from the workings of single brain to the forces that shape civilization. But even that only occupied part of his mind. He immersed himself in poetry, philosophy, and art. He could recite from memory pages of Dante in the original Italian, and entire acts of his favorite French playwrights. He sponsored young artists. He was never without a book, either reading or writing one. Beyond solving individual crimes, Lacassagne became fascinated by the criminals themselves, their thought processes and subculture. Why did they feel compelled to violate the rules of society? Why did they take such a difficult path? He made it his life's work to find out, and studied them as assiduously as a zoologist would scrutinize a favorite species. He visited them in prison, collected their writings, and dissected the brains of those who had been guillotined. He published his findings, along with those of his colleagues, in a journal he founded called the Archives of Criminal Anthropology. In it, scholars would discuss the key issues of the day: crime scene analysis, criminal psychology, capital punishment. Jack the Ripper appeared in his pages, as did Jesse Pomeroy, the boy killer of Boston. On 2 occasions, the journal reviewed the newly published stories about Sherlock Holmes. Fascinating procedures, but why did Holmes never conduct an autopsy? The journal was populated by the cast-offs of society: thieves, murderers, child molesters, the human face of the degenerate instinct. To assist in an autopsy with Dr. Lacassagne was to participate in a memorable educational experience. Here they saw tableaus of a violent death displayed in a medium of shredded tissue and broken bone. Death leaves a signature, and they would learn to read it. A peaceful death versus a violent one, a death by accident, suicide, or crime. By removing an infant's lungs and seeing if they floated, they could determine whether the baby had been stillborn or had lived long enough to take its first breath. They would learn that a frothy liquid in the lungs indicated drowning, that a furrow around the neck pointed to a rope hanging, that break points on opposite sides of the larynx showed that a victim had been strangled with 2 hands. They would employ chemical reagents to identify stains from blood, semen, fecal matter, and rust, often mistaken for blood. The students all flocked to him, remembered Dr. Edmond Locard, a former student himself who became a world-famous criminologist. And so, several times a month, for the 33 years that Dr. Lacassagne taught at the medical faculty of Lyon, students would cluster around their beloved professor who, with no mask on his face and no gloves on his hands, would slice into a cadaver to reveal the mysteries of the last moments of the deceased. So that's Dr. Lacassagne. Dr. Cadaver. And his archenemy was Joseph Vacher, who, about a decade after Jack the Ripper killed 5 people in one neighborhood of London, killed anywhere from 11 to 25 all over the geography of France. And he was the first of his type to be apprehended with modern criminal profiling, to be interrogated with modern techniques, which did not include torture, which they realized did not work and wrote about it. And when it was time for his trial, he played the insanity defense as much as he could, and Dr. Lacassagne was brought in to analyze the case using forensic techniques, and it was his testimony that tipped it. and found Vacher guilty. Vacher was disfigured. He had a paralyzed eye because at one point after shooting his girlfriend, he tried to shoot himself in the head. And in a sense, he was the incarnation of the boogeyman. So this short scene is a scene from his trial, which he tried to turn into a circus trial and upend it. I mentioned a white rabbit hat. He wore this white rabbit hat as a sign of purity, as part of his whole shtick, so to speak. And the scene is a courtroom in a provincial town called Bourg-en-Bresse. As the noise swelled in the courtroom, Vacher made ready for his entrance. The crowd was huge and boisterous, shoving, gossiping, ready for a show. Outside the building, a mob surged against the entrance, calling for the criminal's death. Soldiers of the 23rd Regiment, a famously tough contingent, were having trouble keeping them at bay. At 8:40 a.m., Vacher, surrounded by guards, marched into the courtroom, dressed in velour and wearing his white rabbit hat. With his head up, eyes directed halfway to heaven, he seemed to affect the posture of a saint. But the portrayal was unconvincing. His raggedy beard, which came to a point under his chin, made him appear slightly satanic. His right eye, half closed with paralysis, exaggerated the emotions portrayed by the left, which, in his frantic wandering, gave Vacher an alternately ferocious and desperate look. With his claw-like fingernails and hyperactive limbs, he seemed less a martyred saint than a barely controlled animal. He brandished a rolled-up sheaf of papers. "Glory to Jesus," he proclaimed. "Long live Joan of Arc. Glory to the great martyr of our times. Glory to the great Savior." And incongruously, he who only hears the bell ring only hears a sound. Vacher briefly fumbled with his cap as the judge, Ademir de Costan, entered, wearing the traditional red robes. He had heard the commotion and did not intend to tolerate indignities. He pinned Vacher with a stare. "Listen to me well," he commanded the defendant. "I will not put up with any violence in this courtroom. All your gestures and demonstrations will be useless. You are not going to behave here as you did in prison. I'm absolutely firm on that, and will use all the powers of the law to restrain you. Remember that." Vacher remained silent. The judge now turned his attention to the audience and warned them, too, not to misbehave. "I noticed several ladies in the room," he added. "I should warn them that during these discussions, there will be some things that are difficult for feminine ears. So I would encourage them to leave." "We waited several minutes," wrote a reporter. "Nobody left, and then we all started laughing."
My name's Dayton Duncan. I'm going to read from a book called Scenes of Visionary Enchantment, Reflections on Lewis and Clark. I need to warn you that this is the third book I wrote about Lewis and Clark. I suffer from Lewis and Clark-itis, which is an infectious disease that progresses in stages. Stage 4 is when you wake up on September 3rd and think, oh, September 3rd, well, that's, let me see, the first year they would have been in what's now South Dakota, and the second year, 1805, they'd be crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, and in 1806, they would just about be back to what's now Iowa, and you'd go down and get a cup of coffee and then remember, oh, it's also your birthday. That's the stage I'm at. And it's different than the other books I've written about Lewis and Clark or any of the other 9 books that I've written, in that it's a collection of essays, historical sketches, personal stories, often a mix of them both, and it was released during the time of the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I'm going to read from you from the very opening of it, from the essay called An Unsatisfied Curiosity, which the opening essay is meant to try to explore why 200 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, I believe not only did it still grip me, but why was it something that was still gripping the imagination of the nation? And I go in this essay into all those reasons, but this is the opening of it. In the spring of 1805, 1 year after beginning their expedition, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and their Corps of Discovery past the mouth of the Yellowstone River, reaching what is now Montana, pushing forward farther than any white men had gone before on the mighty Missouri. The riverbank swarmed with game, and the men were astonished not only at the sheer number of animals, but at their relative tameness. I think that we saw at one view nearly 1,000 animals, wrote John Ordway, a young sergeant from New Hampshire, using the free-form spelling and grammar practiced by every journalist on the expedition. Animals was A-N-I-M-E-L-S, and he's about to spell very as V-E-R-R-Y. Quote, "They are not today very wild, for we could go within 100 yards of them in open view of them before they would run off, and then they would go but a short distance before they would stop and feed again. Saw a buffalo calf," he continued, "which had fell down the bank and could not get up again. We helped it up the bank, and it followed us a short distance. The first bighorn sheep they had ever seen appeared on cliffs above the river. Geese, swans, pelicans, and cranes flew overhead. Bald eagles were everywhere, and Ordway got the quills from one of them to use in writing his daily journal. Beaver were so numerous that the smacking of their tails on the water kept Clark awake at night. The men briefly made pets out of a litter of wolf pups. The game is getting so plenty and tame in this country," Ordway eventually wrote, "that some of the party clubbed them out of the way." Then he looked down on the ground and saw the biggest paw prints he had ever seen in his life. And he and the other men began to get excited and powerfully curious, they said, to discover the animal that could leave such huge tracks. The previous winter in what is now North Dakota, the Hidatsa Indians had told the explorers about a bear that they would meet farther west. Big, ferocious, absolutely fearless, and almost impossible to kill. On April 29th, Lewis and another hunter finally encountered their first one and killed it. It was the grizzly, never before described for science. And this bear was big, weighing at least 300 pounds, though not yet fully grown, Lewis estimated, and compared to a black bear, quote, "a much more furious and formidable animal that will frequently pursue the hunter when wounded." Nevertheless, Lewis confidently confided in his journal, while he could understand why Indians with bows and arrows might be frightened of one, Americans with muskets had little to fear. Then they met another grizzly, a, quote, "monster weighing 600 pounds, 9 feet tall from nose to hind feet, claws 7 inches long, which took 10 shots to kill." And then they met another grizzly, and another. One chased Private William Bratton for over half a mile, even though he had put a bullet through the center of its lungs. 3 days later, a hunting party of 6 men opened fire on yet another grizzly, only to find themselves running for their lives across the open prairie when it turned on them. 2 of the hunters turned prey, tossed their rifles away in panic, and jumped off a 20-foot embankment into the river. The bear jumped in after them. Just at the last moment, a shot to its head brought the beast down, and when they dragged him to shore and opened him up, the men found 9 musket balls in his body. Finally, a chastened Lewis wrote in his journal, "I find that the curiosity of our party is pretty well satisfied with respect to this animal." Over the last 20 years, in pursuit of magazine articles, books, and documentary films, and suffering from a lifelong case of road fever, I have retraced the Corps of Discovery's route from St. Louis to the Pacific and back 4 different times. More times than I can count, I've made additional trips to special locations along their route. I've stood on the deck of a reconstruction of their keelboat as it pushed through the red mist of early dawn and navigated against the Missouri's relentless current, not far from the river's confluence with the Mississippi. In Kansas and Nebraska, I've sweltered in summer heat, been eaten alive by chiggers and mosquitoes. In Iowa, I once witnessed a yellow moon ascend into heaven above the final resting place of Sergeant Charles Floyd. In South Dakota, I watched in wonder as 1,000 buffalo thundered over the crests of an undulation in an endless prairie, and then disappeared just as quickly. One January in North Dakota, when the temperature outside was 45 degrees below zero, and the radio was warning all North Dakotans to stay indoors, I theorized that, well, we weren't North Dakotans. So I took a cameraman out at dawn and stood knee-deep in snow with him along the banks of the Missouri, shooting footage of a mighty river that had literally frozen solid overnight. As a reminder of that folly, the frostbite I suffered in my nasal passages that morning still acts up every winter whenever the thermometer approaches zero. I've canoed nearly a dozen times through Montana's magnificent white cliffs, the place Lewis called, quote, scenes of visionary enchantment. I've stood in awe at the base of the Great Falls, unfurled a 15-star flag at the summit of Lemhi Pass, been caught by surprise by a sudden snow squall in early October in Idaho's Bitterroot Mountains. I've gotten seasick in a boat bobbing and rolling on the swells in the mouth of the Columbia River. And I've spent a truly unforgettable night at Fort Clatsop National Memorial on the Oregon coast, along with the spirits of the Corps of Discovery. As I read from their journals by candlelight, I could share their mixed feelings of accomplishment and homesickness as they huddled near the Pacific with an entire continent between themselves and their countrymen. And yet, I must say, I find my curiosity with respect to this expedition is never satisfied.
Hello, my name is Lou Ureneck, and I'm going to read from a book that will be out in the fall. I built a cabin in Maine a couple of years ago and wrote a book about it, and Viking Press will bring the book out. It's called Cabin. I'm going to read two short passages. The first passage is the opening of the book, and then the second passage is the first night that I spent in the cabin. The idea had taken hold of me that I needed nothing so much as a cabin in the woods. 4 rough walls, a metal roof that would ping under the spring rain, and a porch that looked down a wooded hillside. I had been city-bound for nearly a decade, dealing with the usual knockdowns and disappointments of middle age. I had lost a job, my mother had died, and I was climbing back from a divorce that had left me nearly broke. I was a little wobbly but still standing, and I was looking for something that would put me back in life's good graces. I wanted a project that would engage the better part of me, and the notion of building a cabin, a boy's dream really, seemed a way to get a purchase on life's next turn. I won't lie, I needed it badly. So on a day of warm September sunshine in September 2008, after having bought a piece of land in western Maine the previous February, I stood in a corner of my brother Paul's suburban backyard in Portland and examined a stack of lumber I had dropped there more than a decade earlier. I had to stomp down the weeds with my brown leather brogues to get to it. I hadn't yet bought a pair of work boots. I was dressed for the classroom where I now earn my living, disguised as a college professor. Khaki trousers, button-down shirt, and semi-round tortoise-shell glasses. I confronted the wood, or maybe as a symbolic artifact of an earlier life, it confronted me. It was a temporary standoff with the past. Piled chest high, the wood made an incongruous sight among the neighborhood's turquoise swimming pools, oversized gas grills, and slumping badminton nets. To a passerby, it must have looked like a heap of old railroad ties dumped by the side of the road. I brushed the rough surface of the wood with my hand and pressed a thumbnail into its pulpy flesh. It was spongy, not a good sign. A few of the boards showed sawdust and smooth channels that were the work of carpenter ants. There were many more pieces, heavy posts, big square beams, and long silvery rafters with bird's mouth mortises that had come through the years of sun and snow mostly sound. I couldn't help feeling some affinity with the wood, weathered but mostly intact. This is what I had hoped for on the drive up from Boston, where I lived and worked. I had counted on salvaging enough lumber from the pile to form the frame of the cabin that had already taken shape in my mind. And then a little further into the book, I chose a Friday in April to spend my first night in the cabin. There was still no roof cover and the walls remained unsheathed. In other words, it was a frame open to the weather. I drove up from Boston, arrived an hour before dark, and spread my sleeping bag on the deck. I heard a commotion of splashing on the pond below. It sounded like slap, splash, slap, splash. I walked down the path to the pond and saw one Canada goose madly chasing another. Neither was fully lifting from the water. They were sort of running and flapping over the surface, one clearly in pursuit of the other. The splashes looked like machine gun fire hitting the water. I was witnessing two males in combat over an unseen female. In the mating season, a female goose selects the male based on his ability to protect her, and what was occurring in front of me was a powerful male demonstrating his prowess to a keenly observing female. Once geese are paired, the mating is an elaborate ballet. It begins with the male and female facing each other, undulating their long necks and making soft goose sounds, which is like dry wood rubbed against slate. It is a sound that seems to contain both effort and pleasure. When the moment comes for the act of mating, they go off by themselves at night and on the water in a kind of private tryst. The male and female extend their necks horizontally to the water, dipping their beaks. The female spreads her wings over the surface of the water and slightly submerges. Upon completion, the female bathes herself with the male watching, and then the male bathes himself as she observes. The watery ruckus unfolding in front of me was a prelude to the courtship and promised that I would have fluffy goslings in the pond in another month. I still had time before dark, and it was too early to crawl into the sleeping bag, so I walked down the Adams Road and turned onto Cold Brook, following it downstream. I came to a beaver pond. A couple of swallows swooped over the water, picking insects out of the air, and then I saw a beaver making his way across the pond, only his big head breaking through the surface. He spotted me and gave me the angry slap. He went down and did not come back up. I waited quietly. I walked a little farther to an open place near the brook and listened. This seemed to be a perfect place to hear woodcock whistling. It was the time of year for their courtship display in high flights and sudden twisting drops. But I heard nothing except the sweet melody of the peepers, which was its own reward. It is among the brightest and most cheerful sounds of the woods. The sun was setting now, so I headed back. I reached the big pond, and the sun's rays lit the trees along the far shore and sent a red glow over the water's still surface. Once again, I witnessed that incredible bowl of light, this time as it was rapidly losing luminescence, like a gas lamp that has been shut but whose glow takes a few seconds to extinguish. I returned to the cabin, taking my time along the way to examine the hillside. I arranged my sleeping bag and slipped into it. The deck was hard, but at least it was flat and without rocks, as there would have been had I been sleeping on the ground. The peepers were singing loudly, and occasionally I felt a cool puff of damp spring air come up from below when the wind lifted. The air smelled of the wet, thawing ground and the new season. Somewhere off in the distance, I heard an owl's windy, 9-syllable hoot. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? The stars shone brightly in the sky, and I watched them through the crossbeams of the cabin frame. It was as if I were looking through the rigging of a sailing ship, maybe a coastwise schooner making its way down the Atlantic shore. I folded my hands behind my head and stared upward. Another gentle, damp breeze blew across the deck, and I imagined my cabin lifting into the sky like some heavenly gaff-rigged raft, ascending into the night sky toward the stars, tacking toward Polaris, and then hauling south and west toward Orion and bright Betelgeuse, and eastward for a closer look at the planet Saturn, and silently behind a big spinnaker full of moonlight, sailing home again. I fell asleep to the sound of the geese gabbing away in the pond here on Earth.
Hi, I'm John Stauffer, and I will read from my book, Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. When Douglass and Lincoln met for the third time on March 4th, 1865, the mood was celebratory. Douglass came to Washington to attend Lincoln's second inauguration. The war was almost over. 170,000 blacks were in uniform, marching triumphantly across the South, and Congress had recently passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery throughout the United States. The day was bleak and rainy. Mud covered the unpaved streets, and people streamed around the Capitol in most wretched plight. Many of them had been up all night, having taken special inaugural trains that arrived in Washington that morning. Between the cinder dust from trains and the mud and rain, the 30,000 people attending the ceremony looked gray and worn out. Crinoline was smashed, skirts bedaubed, moire antique, velvet, laces, and such dry goods were streaked with mud from end to end. Douglass had arrived a few days early, and on March 3rd took tea with Salmon P. Chase, Lincoln's former Secretary of the Treasury and now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Douglass had met Chase on the abolition circuit before the war and liked him. He was thrilled that Chase had replaced Roger Taney, whose Dred Scott decision had been partly responsible for the war. A new robe had been made for the Chief Justice to administer the oath of office, and Douglass helped him try it on. The new Iron Dome now sat proudly atop the Capitol. Renovations had stopped briefly in 1861, but Lincoln ordered work on the dome to proceed. Completing it symbolized hope for reunion, he believed. But to many Democrats, including Herman Melville, the new Iron Dome was a far more ominous symbol. Power unanointed may come, dominion unsought by the free, and the Iron Dome, stronger for stress and strain, fling her huge shadow athwart the main, but the founder's dream shall flee. Melville worried that the Iron Dome would fling her huge shadow athwart the main streets of America and impose unprecedented dominion on communities and towns, thus destroying the founder's dream of a loose confederation of states and a decentralized government. The bronze Statue of Liberty stood proudly atop the dome. She looked a little strange wearing a helmet rather than a cap, as the Greek goddess typically did. But Jefferson Davis, who as Secretary of War had overseen the design of the statue, knew that in ancient Greece a cap on a woman was a badge of the freed slave, and so he had suggested a helmet instead. While Douglass stood in the crowd waiting for the ceremonies to begin, a friend pointed out Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's new vice president. Johnson noticed Douglass, and his expression immediately turned to one of bitter contempt and aversion. When he saw Douglass watching him, he assumed a more friendly appearance. For Douglass, it was one of those moments when the doors of a man's soul open and his true character emerges. He turned to his friend and said, "Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race." Although Lincoln and Johnson's policies on Reconstruction were quite similar, their personal behaviors toward blacks were worlds apart. With so many people gathered around the Capitol, Douglass worried about an assassination attempt. In this, he was not alone. Since the fall of 1864, reports of conspiracies had circulated through the North, and Lincoln had recently hired a personal bodyguard. During the inauguration, plainclothes policemen stood at his side, armed with 38 Colt revolvers. John Wilkes Booth was also there, watching Lincoln from the right balcony. Douglass stood directly in front of Lincoln and had an excellent view. Perhaps he should have worried about himself, for 1 year later in Baltimore, someone tried to assassinate him. As it turned out, the ceremony was wonderfully quiet, earnest, and solemn, Douglass noted. There was a leaden stillness about the crowd as Lincoln delivered his address, and Douglass thought it sounded more like a sermon than a state paper. In his speech, Lincoln emphasizes God's inscrutability. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God. and each invokes his aid against the other. He imagines a wrathful God wreaking vengeance against slaveholders, but carefully avoids presuming to know God's will. Such presumption would be hubris, he implies. The Almighty has his own purposes. The proper attitude toward people and nations should be one of humility, tolerance, and forgiveness, with malice toward none, with charity for all. After the ceremony, Douglass went to the reception at the White House. As he was about to enter, 2 policemen rudely yanked him away and told him that no persons of color were allowed to enter. Douglass said there must be some mistake, for no such order could have come from the president. The police refused to yield until Douglass sent word to Lincoln that he was being detained at the door. Douglass found the president in the elegant East Room, standing like a mountain pine in his grand simplicity and homely beauty. "Here comes my friend," Lincoln said, and took Douglass by the hand. "I am glad to see you. I saw you in the crowd today listening to my inaugural address." He asked Douglass how he liked it, adding, "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours." "Mr. Lincoln, that was a sacred effort," Douglass said.
Hi, I'm Hampton Sides, and I'm going to read a passage from my most recent book, Hellhound on His Trail, which is about the assassination of Martin Luther King and the hunt for James Earl Ray. I think all writers need to go back to the place where they came from, and in this case, I needed to go back to the pivotal moment in my hometown of Memphis. The assassination of Martin Luther King was the most devastating, most controversial event in Memphis's history. The passage I'm going to read is really setting the stage for the assassination and the events that lead up to the assassination by trying to describe Memphis, which is a really gothic, cool, weird, screwed up, fascinating, beautiful city. I don't know how many of you have been there. The fact that Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis, of all places, seems scripted by fate in some ways. And so this has to do with the thing called the Memphis Cotton Carnival. Memphis is a city built on cotton. It's the capital of the Mississippi Delta. And it's one of the last places before the Civil War where people really made a run at this sort of plantation mentality, this plantation society. The chapter is called City of White Gold. In early May 1967, 300 miles downstream from St. Louis, the citizens of Memphis stood along the cobblestone banks, enjoying the musky coolness of the river. 75,000 people, dressed to be seen, waited in the twilight. They'd come from all the secret crews, from the mystic society of the Memphi, from Osiris and Ramet and Sphinx. They'd come from all the clubs, Chickasaw, University, Colonial, Hunt and Polo, the Memphis Country Club, and from the garden societies, the good families, the old families, in their finest James Davis clothes, bourbon flasks in hand, assembled for what was called the South's greatest party. The brown Mississippi, wide with northern snowmelt, was a confusion of cross-currents and boils. In the main channel, whole trees could be seen shooting downstream. A mile across the river lay the floodplain of Arkansas, a world of chiggers and alligator gars and water moccasins that lived in swampy oxbow lakes. On the long sandbars, feral pigs ran among graveyards of driftwood and rotten cypress stumps. But in the clearings, beyond these wild margins, were hundreds and hundreds of miles of cotton fields. Cotton as far as the eye could see, row after perfect row. Gossypium hirsutum, white gold, mined from the world's richest alluvium. Cotton had grown along the Nile near the original Memphis, and cotton was what modern Memphis had come to celebrate on this fine, humid evening of May 10th, 1967. In the fields of Arkansas and down in nearby Mississippi, the little darlings had already begun to push through the dirt. The crop dusters were preparing to rain down their chemicals, and the old true cycle was in the offing. Now it was time for Memphians to pay homage and to bless another season in cotton's splendid realm. Tonight was the high pageant that kicked off the whole week, the majestic arrival of the king and queen, sitting upon their thrones with their sequined court all around them on a great glittery barge that was scheduled to nudge into Memphis harbor shortly after sunset. It was a celebration not only of cotton, but also of the peculiarly settled life that thrived on it, the life of dove hunts and pig roasts and debutante balls, the genteel agrarian world that could still be found in the fertile realms surrounding Memphis. Cotton, cotton, cotton. Memphis couldn't get enough of it. Cotton was still king. It would always be king. The skies over Arkansas ripened to a final brilliant red before closing into darkness. It seemed as though the sun had literally buried itself in cotton fields. An orchestra played strains of Vivaldi, and the heavens crackled with fireworks. Then, from under the bridge, a dazzling vessel slipped into view, with the crowds gasping in wonder. At first, it was just a burst of bright light, a diaphanous vision floating out on the currents. As it drew nearer to the harbor, the ravishing details began to emerge. The barge was the size of a football field, with a giant Art Deco cotton bowl rising over the sparkling set. Egyptian motifs were woven into the decorations, pyramids, sphinxes, hieroglyphics. The Old South meets the land of the pharaohs. Seated on their thrones, high in the towering cotton bowl, were King Joseph and Queen Blanche, 1967's monarchs, wearing their crowns, holding their scepters. As always, they'd been chosen in secret by some obscure protocol known only to the mystic society of the Memphi. As always, he was an older man, a business potentate, while she was a nubile paragon of southern pulchritude, college-aged and presumably a virgin. They were blindingly white people, in blindingly white clothes, sitting high in their resplendent perch. In unison, they cupped their gloved hands and gave the crowds tiny swiveling waves as if to say, "Here we are, there you are, we're all here." More than 100 people made up the royal court, all posed together on the barge like the largest wedding party ever assembled. There were the duchesses, the counts, the pages, the princesses, and their tuxedoed escorts. There were the young girls who curtsied with labored formality and attended the train of Her Majesty's gown. There were the weevils, the masked green jesters whose identities were unknown. On one side of the royal barge stood the ladies of the realm, belles from plantation towns all over the Mississippi Delta. On the other side were the ladies in waiting, belles from the city, from good families, and of marriageable age. The court moved about the barge in a carefully choreographed promenade. Everyone was smiling, bowing, waving, beaming. "Don't get wise with me," the king warned, "or I'll have you beheaded." When the music reached a fever pitch, King Joseph and Queen Blanche rose and took a bow. All along the bluff, the 75,000 loyal subjects erupted in thunderous cheers. "Hail, King Cotton and his queen." Then, in a swirl of lights, the court began to parade off the stage and off the barge and onto the old cobblestones, the royals closely guarded by uniformed young men dressed as Confederate colonels. Like Peabody ducks, the revelers strutted down a long red carpet to a waiting convoy of Cadillac convertibles and were whisked away to the first parties of the season. Thank you.
My name is Isabel Wilkerson. I am going to be reading from The Warmth of Other Suns, the day that I met Dr. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Los Angeles, 1996. The panel door rises a story high and would befit a museum or government office, but is actually the front door of a Spanish revival south of Wilshire. The door opens, and there stands a one-time bourbon-swilling army captain and deft-handed surgeon who, now in his later years, is a regular at the blackjack tables and the trifectas at Santa Anita. But he is at the heart of it all, and perhaps most important, a long-standing, still bitter, and somewhat obsessive expatriate from the 20th century South, the heartbreak Jim Crow land he chose to reject before it could reject him again. He is a Californian now, this Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. He is the color of strong coffee and has waves in his hair, which he lets grow untamed as Einstein's, but then brushes back like the boys in the band. He's wearing a white cotton island shirt, loose slacks, and sandals, the uniform of the well-to-do LA pensioner. He has the build and bearing of a Sammy Davis Jr. and not a little of the showmanship and delightful superficiality that seem to grow on people in certain circles of LA. He walks straight-backed and slew-footed into the foyer, past the curved faux Gone with the Wind staircase and the East Asian pottery. He gestures toward the living room, an imposing ballroom of a space that dwarfs him in its volume, fairly frozen in the seafoam carpet and hot pink tulip chairs out of a sherbety Doris Day movie from the 50s. The whole effect is as starched and formal as the tuxedos he used to wear to the parties he threw for himself back when his wife Alice was alive and the money was raining down like confetti. He seems accustomed to people fawning over the place, and with the prim air of leading men of his favorite movies from back in the 40s, insists on serving his guests a slice of lemon pound cake and vanilla ice cream on Rosenthal china, whether they would like to have it or not. His heavy-lidded eyes look straight into those of the listener and have a distractingly thick fringe of lashes like those seen on babies and starlets. He is a physician, or was for most of his adult life, and by most accounts, a very good one, and is prone to pontificate like a man of his years and accomplishments. But he is just as likely to interrupt himself and check the time to see if he can still make the 1 o'clock at the Hollywood Park racetrack. His photo albums are filled with an unlikely assortment of bookies and blues singers and dentists and fraternity men and surgeons and society people whose approval he craved, even though he knew they were too pretentious to matter really. He doesn't say it because it would be gauche and hardly worth mentioning, but there happen to be a lot of little Roberts around town due to the fact that over the years he delivered a number of baby boys whose mothers were so grateful for his firm hand and calming reassurances at the precise moment of truth that they named their sons not after their husbands, but after the doctor who had delivered their babies. Before he begins his story, he tells you it's a long one, and you can't get it all. He's lived too many lives, done too much, known too many people, ridden so high and so low that there's no point in fooling yourself into thinking you can capture the whole of it. You could try, of course, and he agrees to give as much as he can. I love to talk, he says, a smile forming on his still chiseled face as he sits upright in his tulip chair. And I am my favorite subject. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Orlean, and I'm going to read a little bit from my new book about Rin Tin Tin. The section I'm going to read is about my trying to find the birthplace of the original, the first Rin Tin Tin, and my trip to France in hopes of finding that. It was late summer when the light was liquid and everything green was etched with gold. I took a train to Nancy, an elegant old city of fountains and figurine shops, and then drove to Toul, a few kilometers away, assuming that someone in Toul could direct me from there. It was mid-afternoon, mid-week, mid-month. Toul was as quiet as a sound stage. Every fixture of life was in place, but every door was locked. Every window shuttered. Finally, I happened on a cafe near a small town square with a dribbling fountain. A half-dozen people were having wine and coffee around a small round table. They had the brash, happy drunkenness of employees who had just been unexpectedly given the afternoon off. All of them were smoking so furiously that it looked as if they were sitting around a small campfire. I sat at a table nearby and ordered a coffee. After a minute, I gathered my nerve and my high school French and leaned over to ask if any of them knew how to get to Fleury, where Rin Tin Tin had been born. They sucked their breaths almost as one. Then they frowned at me. Fleury? One of them repeated. Yes, Fleury, I said, trying to go lightly on the R. Not easy for an Ohioan, but I tried. Fleury? Fleury? Yes, Fleury, I said. I had a copy of Lee's notes with me. I held out the pages and read the part where he had written, I had been sent to Fleury on the morning of the 15th. At first, they shook their heads. My heart skipped. No one spoke. The fountain dribbled. At last, one of the smokers put his cigarette down and beamed at me. Oh, he said triumphantly, you mean Fleury? Another one gasped, oh, oui, Fleury, Fleury. I could discern no difference at all in what they were saying, but they were now congratulating themselves as if they'd cracked an Aztec code. Then they all lit new cigarettes and poured wine and went on with their afternoon recess. Excuse me, I said after a moment, enunciating as carefully as I could. Do you know how to get to Fleury? The road to Fleury rose and dipped along a ridge, the soft fields falling away in every direction, the huge churches perched here and there, looming and gloomy and dark. Just outside of Toul, I passed a hippie couple walking on the shoulder of the road, carrying a million bags and packs and baskets and boxes. They looked more like a parade float than actual people. A raggedy dog ambled along with them. Hard to tell what he was at first, but when I glanced back at them in my rearview mirror, I could see that the dog had the high forehead and erect ears of a German shepherd. A minute after I passed the hippie couple, I slowed for a leathery old farmer walking with his dog. It was also a German shepherd, glossy and muscular, lashing the farmer's legs with his thick tail as they strode along. I knew that seeing these dogs was merely coincidence, that since I'd begun thinking about Rin Tin Tin, I was seeing him everywhere, and this after so many years of feeling like I never saw German shepherds anymore. It was as if the sheer force of thinking about the dog had made him materialize, as if I'd been seeding the clouds with memories of Rin Tin Tin until it rained. I had Bruce Springsteen on a German radio station, the road skimming along besides quiet fields and quiet houses and the occasional brown cow, and then suddenly I was in Fleury. It was nothing much, a cluster of fawn brown houses, a handsome monument honoring General Pershing's army, a little schoolyard, a stop sign. At the center of town, there was an informational plaque explaining its history of ruination and its ever-changing name. As if to try to outrun its misfortune, the town had renamed itself time and again. Fleury, Fleury-au-Bois, Fleury, Fleury, which is why it had been so hard to find on maps. I drove down an alley off the main road. The village houses went on for a short distance, and then the alley narrowed and the houses petered out. Off to my right was an open expanse, empty except for a rusty soccer goal, a life-size plastic clown on a huge rusty spring, and one large white sheep, his mouth pressed firmly to the ground, chopping at the grass around the soccer goal. Even if this was the right place where Rin Tin Tin had been born, the remains of the kennel probably would have since sunk beneath 90 years of accumulated soil and gravel and grass. I sat for a while watching the sheep work his way industriously around the soccer goal, trying to imagine what it had been like in 1918, which was, of course, unimaginable, and waiting for someone walking by to lead me to a spot and say, "This happened here," as if that alone would make it come alive again. I had come to see where Rin Tin Tin was born, but what you see in the Meuse Valley, besides clusters of houses and nice old farms and checkerboards of fields, is many, many cemeteries. The dead are all soldiers from World War I. I passed a German cemetery at Andilly with 33,000 graves, a Franco-British cemetery at Chaillot-Minelot with many thousands more, the Douaumont ossuary at Verdun, a terrifying gray stone building shaped like a jumbo jet plunging nose first into the ground, holds the remains of 130,000 unidentified soldiers, the jumbled bones of French and German boys laid to rest according to where they were found on the battlefield, their remains commingled and then parceled out like an annotated map of the dead. On the outskirts of Fleury, I pulled over to the side of the road just to stretch my legs. When I got out of the car and looked around, I realized I had parked in front of yet another cemetery, the Necropolis Nationale, a pie-shaped plot cut into a mossy hillside with 4,000 French soldiers' graves. After reading some of the tombstones, I realized that many of them had died on the same day in 1918. A few miles past the necropolis, I drove by an iron gate trimmed with gorgeous, glossy medallions. It was so striking and singular in the middle of these farm fields that I doubled back to look at it, thinking it might be a grand estate or a country club. It turned out to be the Saint-Mihiel American Cemetery, a burial ground operated by the American Battle Monuments Commission, which oversees American military cemeteries in foreign countries. There are 8 American military cemeteries in Europe. Saint-Mihiel is the 3rd largest, 40 acres, 4,000 dead. The cemetery director, a stout, cheerful man named Bobby Bell, came out of his office to greet me when I walked in. He told me he had worked at a number of American cemeteries in Europe. He said he liked Saint-Mihiel most of all, and he showed me around with as much enthusiasm as if he were trying to sell me a plot. The constant presence of death I was encountering while searching for Rin Tin Tin's birthplace was starting to depress me. But the cemetery at Saint-Mihiel was actually one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. The crosses on the graves were a luminous white, lined up with an almost Moroccan symmetry against the pure geometry of freshly mowed grass and sharply sheared boxwood hedges and soldiery rows of linden trees. The names on the grave had another sort of symmetry, matching boys with their home states. Howard Lewis of Colorado, Vincenzo Brandolini of Connecticut, Jens Larson of Iowa, Pinckney Rouse of North Carolina, Stanley Steubens of Michigan. It was an almost mathematical sensation walking up and down the green rows, the late light throwing long lines across the flat field, 2 graves per stride, 50 strides per row. The steady repetition was like a drumbeat, hypnotizing. I walked on, reading name after name, soothed by the rhythm of my steps, the soft, spongy ground yielding under my feet, and by the flashing white of the crosses as I passed them, the whoosh of the wind tossing the linden tree's leaves with exaggerated drama, the way little girls toss their hair. At last, I stopped at the end of a row, in front of a statue of a young army officer in a field uniform, trench helmet in hand. Above the figure was engraved, Il dort loin des siens dans la douce terre de France. He sleeps far from his family in the gentle land of France. Beneath that, on the pedestal, it said, Blessed are they that have the home longing, for they shall go home. Thank you.
My My name is Gage Talese, and I'm going to read something that I wrote more than 50 years ago. My first job when I got on the staff of the New York Times was in the sports department. I was 24, and although I had no aspirations to becoming a sports writer, rather wanted to write about sports people as I would write about other people, write about human character rather than what it is that they did as athletes, I was rather drawn to prize fighting. Among the ones I've never seen prize fighting before I got a job in the New York Times, but it seemed to me that prize fighters are more like writers in that they were solitary performers. And if you didn't do well as a prize fighter, it was so obvious, as if you'd written something that the critics tore apart. It was a very uncertain and lonely profession, and I think a lot of good writers, not so good writers, but found in the sports, in the boxing ring, something akin to the problems and challenges of becoming a writer. And it wasn't surprising that such writers as varied as Norman Mailer and Joyce Carol Oates and Bud Schulberg and George Plimpton and many people, A.J. Liebling, that Susan mentioned earlier today. Many people were just loved watching prize fighters, and in my case, loved talking to prize fighters. And one of the first assignments that I had when I first got a job at the New York Times was to interview a light heavyweight fighter. And I wrote this when I was 27, and it was published in 1958 on the daily paper of the New York Times in July. Nearly every day, the young prize fighter is told to get lots of rest, to avoid smoking, to watch his diet, to shun women, and to stay in shape so that if he's knocked down, he will have the strength to get up and get hit again. At 22, the prize fighter has sad, dark eyes. He has jagged, small facial scars and a flattened nose that has been hit by obscure amateurs he has already forgotten. He has had 6 professional fights as a middleweight. Nobody has beaten him. In the closet of his $11 a week furnished room at 340 Union Street in Brooklyn, he has 8 suits, a dozen silk shirts, and 14 pair of shoes. He also has a girlfriend named Ramona. Both were born in Puerto Rico. Each week, Ramona, who is 22 also, and her mother come to clean the fighter's room. The mother complains that it is always dirty, that he never picks up his socks, that he has too many shoes. Soon, he says, he will marry Ramona and will move to Manhattan, close to Stillman's gymnasium and far from the mother. While the fighter says he is at constant odds with the mother, he never argues with the manager, Cus D'Amato, who also manages the heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson. Cus, he is like a second father to me, said the young prize fighter yesterday in a small room off 8th Avenue. Cus D'Amato, a square-shouldered man in a blue silk suit, smiled and asked, "Have you ever disapproved of anything I've done for you?" "No," said the fighter. "Haven't I always welcomed suggestions from you?" "Yes," said the fighter. Cus D'Amato smiled again and went on to say, "I consider this boy extraordinary. This boy will build up boxing in New York. He will be a hero to the Puerto Rican people, and he will aid juvenile delinquency problems." "This boy can also draw a crowd," said Teddy Brenner, the boxing promoter. When he beat Otis Woodward in September 29 at St. Nicholas Arena, we had a gate of 7,200 bucks, our largest in 10 years. As the men talked, the prize fighter sat quietly in the chair listening. Then he got up and went down the flight of stairs to 52nd Street and headed for Stillman's gymnasium. Puerto Ricans, recognizing the fighter, waved at him, and some followed him into the gymnasium to watch him spar. The fighter is a quick, clever puncher, standing 5 feet 10 inches. His chest muscles twitch this way and that as he moves around the ring, jabbing at a sparring partner without malice. From ringside came the Puerto Ricans yelling, "Pego duro, pego duro," hit hard, hit hard. A half hour later, he was in the locker room, a towel over his neck, talking about how he hated the Army, how he liked fighting on the Olympic team of 1956, and how earlier this year he made headlines all over the country by supposedly knocking down Floyd Patterson in a sparring session in California before the Patterson fight with Roy Harris. He was a little off balance, the young fighter said, so when I hit Patterson, he went down. I also boxed at Greenwood Lake with Sugar Ray Robinson. I think I hurt him once. For his first 5 professional fights, the fighter was paid an average of $250 each. But on September 29, when he lured Puerto Ricans into St. Nicholas Arena in Manhattan, he was able to clear $1,500. He spent $300 to send his father to his father in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and he banked the rest. At 3 p.m., he was starting up the engine of his 1952 gray Plymouth, parked on 52nd Street, about to leave for Brooklyn, where he would take a nap. He will relax today, but tomorrow night at St. Nicholas Arena, he will have his 7th professional fight, this one against a Philadelphian named Kid Ansem. The young prize fighter believes he will knock out Ansem. He also believes that with time, he will win the middleweight championship of the world. This young prize fighter's name happens to be Jose Torres. But he actually thinks and talks and dreams like dozens of other inexperienced professionals who train every day at Stillman's Gymnasium. And they bang each other around between television commercials. And they seem to agree that despite all the punching, boxing still beats working for a living. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for coming. Maybe if you're thinking ahead, same time next year, hopefully we'll see you back. And again, I want to thank our readers and the panelists who are here today, and you'll have an opportunity to talk with them and hopefully buy their books and support this wonderful form of writing. So again, I want to thank them for what they did. That was wonderful.